Welcome, and thank you for tuning into Instinctive Talk. I'm your host, Jay Insalaco. This episode is to promote hope to my fellow peers and their loved ones who support them. Today on Instinctive Talk, we're going to have Kitt O'Malley, author of Balancing Act, Writing Through a Bipolar Life. Is a mental health advocate, public speaker, and former psychotherapist who lives with bipolar disorder. Both her personal experience and clinical background inform her advocacy and enable her both to help herself and guide others towards mental health recovery. Kitt has a bachelor's in legal studies from UC Berkeley, a master's in psychology from New College of California, and has attended Fuller Theological Seminary. How you doing? My name is Jay Insalaco, and I'm your host of Instinctive Talk. Today I want to welcome Kitt O'Malley to the show. How you doing, Kitt?
Doing well. Sorry, I just took a sip of coffee.
It's all right. So how you doing?
Good. And you?
Good, thank you. I want to welcome you. I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, I've been looking over your website, and it's amazing. And I know that you've gotten accolades for how good your website is put together. And I went on there and I found a lot of information. So in the show notes, I'm going to put down your website so people can go and link up with you on your social sites, know where to purchase your book, which is a Balancing Act, Writing Through a Bipolar Life, which is a great book. I read it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. I'd like to start off today and go into the diagnosis years. If you can go into that a little bit, Kitt, I'd appreciate it.
You bet. And this happens a lot with people with bipolar disorder, that they're diagnosed as depressed because we tend to go and seek help when we're depressed. And also there's a certain point at which part of it's natural progression of bipolar disorder. For people like me, everybody presents differently, but for my bipolar disorder. I started off at 18 in my journey. I was a student at UCLA, and I became severely depressed and suicidal. And I became, mostly it was ideation, but one day I actually got together the means and wrote a suicide note and had a plan for when I would do it and how I would do it. And I basically took a step back and observed myself, what I was doing, and thought, no, I'm actually going to do it this time. It's not just a thought, it's, okay. And so I called a friend of mine to stay with me. She's still a dear friend. So she was to just sit with me until I got in to see a therapist that day. And I went to the resident assistant in the dorm and I said, I need to see a psychologist today. And I need to see somebody really good because I'm suicidal. And I actually told her the whole thing. And so I got in to see someone, and he was a cognitive behavioral therapist. So he helped me address the thoughts that were not true. Like, I'm not worthy of life. My family would be better off without me. The world would be better off without me. All those sort of horrible thoughts, to write them to be thoughts that were more rational and true, such as, which I didn't believe, but I had to, basically rewire my brain, retrain my brain, that the world, that I did have value and that I was loved and things like that. So that helped me get me through the crisis, and that skill, that ability to sort of stop when you have a destructive thought and to rewrite it, which is sort of a theme of mine in terms of writing being therapeutic, helped me to get through that crisis. So throughout my 20s, I was treated using psychotherapy, different modalities of psychotherapy, not just cognitive behavioral. I also did some art therapy, and I did some what's called psychodynamic therapy, where you talk about, basically, it comes from Freud. It's, was the founder, but you talk about your family of origin, okay, and how that, your parents, how that affected you.
Right.
And I did come from an alcoholic family, and I had a mother with an undiagnosed mental health issues. She was emotionally abusive, and she wasn't aware of her behavior or its effect on us or on anybody. And so I did that until I got really, really sick, because that got me sicker and sicker and sicker. And then at 30, I had trauma happening. My grandmother died. A friend from high school died of AIDS. It was in the early 90s. So it was like the AIDS epidemic was still really, really bad. And I was in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I had a lot of friends who were HIV positive or who had full-blown AIDS. And it was very traumatic for me to lose people I cared for.
Yeah, it sounds like it must have been a tough time.
It was a tough time. It was a really tough time. And thank goodness for, thank God for, advances in medicine there, that people are living with HIV and living well. I went to somebody who told me that I was in the adolescent phase of development, and that was why this stuff was going on. And and he took me off those medications and put me on a tricyclic, and I ended up ramping, triggered mania, and I ended up ramping to a week of full-blown mania where I had psychotic thoughts. I couldn't sleep for a week, and I had streaming thoughts, 3 different streams of thoughts going through my mind rapidly at high speed simultaneously. And one stream was zeros and ones, which is binary code, but I wasn't a computer, so I didn't know what it meant. It's just a bunch of zeros and ones. Another stream of thought was about Christian saints, which actually was something that I had a passion for and had some knowledge about.
Right, because I read somewhere that you went to seminary and you felt like you had a calling, and
yes,
and you ended up going to seminary twice.
Yeah, this was way later. I went to seminary. I actually went to seminary after being diagnosed bipolar and after having been hospitalized for that. So, but I had a nagging sense of call since I was actually back in my early 20s before this. So, but because of my experience of mental health issues, starting with the depression, I was afraid that it was, that it had to do with my mental health issues. And I also didn't want to go to, when I first started feeling that feeling, it didn't make sense to me because, I started off by being agnostic and having this sense of calling. So that didn't make sense. And also I basically was, I wasn't active in the church, but I had been, I was baptized Roman Catholic and came from, my parents had been Roman Catholics growing up. So it's like, well, I can't become a priest because I'm a woman. And I knew my whole life I was supposed to become a mother. So, so it didn't make sense to me. Only later did it make sense. And as I discuss it later, I'll talk about how that made sense. So I had the Christian saints, which I really I actually still do identify with. The Christian saints. And then also there was a stream of thought about chaos theory, which is physics and mathematics. So after this week, a friend of mine called my dad and my priest, an Episcopal priest. I ended up becoming an Episcopalian at this time in my life, in the midst of all this, as things were getting bad. And actually in the midst of the depression. So, and it was a good thing because this priest was able to come immediately over with a seminarian who was a bipolar seminarian. He and the seminarian just sort of made sure I was safe and were there to prompt me to call my psychiatrist, who put me on antipsychotics for 3 days just to stop the mania. And then he put me back on the tricyclic, but on a low dose, and carefully watched. And my dad, my friend also called my dad. My dad flew up and later my mom, and they stayed with me as I was trying to get myself back together. But I just found that I was unable to. And I ended up moving back in with my parents and going on a different medication regimen. And when I moved back in with my parents, the psychiatrist I saw then asked me if I'd ever been on lithium or if anybody had ever discussed lithium with me. And I said, no, but I will. But if you think I should be on lithium, if you see me as bipolar, I will take it. And so he thought that the manic episode was caused by the medication. And because I was high functioning and never had been, hospitalized or anything up until that episode that was preceded by these rapid medication changes and this medication that triggered it, that he thought that, we'll just very carefully get me onto an SSRI. So he tried a different SSRI and very low dose. And whenever my thoughts would start to race, I'd call and I'd say, my thoughts are racing. And so he'd say, okay, let's titrate it more slowly. Let's reduce your dose and, go out longer. And so I actually was stabilized on an SSRI. And basically was my treatment, was being treated for depression with antidepressants throughout my 30s.
So even through all of that, they still didn't diagnose you as bipolar, even through those, excuse me, those episodes that you had?
Yeah, it was the one episode, but yeah. And then earlier there was just a feeling of being called, which I do discuss some on my blog or in my book, and in parts of some sections. I'm not sure if it's where it is on my website, but they thought that the earlier experience of feeling like I'm called by God which was when I was in a period of grief, had to do with my drug use at that time, because I was I was into like Buddhism and meditation and all that kind of stuff when I was an undergraduate Berkeley student. I was a typical Berkeley student. I was smoking pot, a little hash, all that. They thought that was maybe had to do with my drug use and the grief, and that it was just situational.
Well, I read that you got married and that you had a son, which was a great time in your life, and then soon after is when what was it, 27 months, when I think your son was 27 months old, and then that's when you were diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It must have been a relief to find out that you were rightfully diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Is that like where the recovery like truly started?
No, not at all.
No. Okay. Okay.
Actually, what's interesting is that I went from being okay with living with the diagnosis of depression in terms of my identity to, not that it was great, but I was able to, I was able to accept that diagnosis. It's not there's not a lot of stigma with the diagnosis of depression in society, because it's so common. But when my diagnosis changed to bipolar disorder, I put my son in daycare and went back to work, thinking that he was better off in somebody else's care. I thought that, okay, you can be a good mom with depression, but if I have bipolar disorder, I now have a severe, progressive, mental illness, and I'm not going to be a good mom. I'm a danger to my child. So that was definitely not acceptance. That was the opposite of it. I had a lot of self-stigma, internalized stigma attached to that diagnosis. And so it really wasn't until I just wasn't able to maintain being a mom and working, I tried to do that, and I ended up a couple of years later after that, when my son was 4, falling apart and being hospitalized voluntarily. I went, I was told I was voluntarily hospitalized, and I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and in partial hospitalization, which is like you spend the whole day at the hospital, you're not behind the locked doors, but you're so I spent every day, all day, like a work day, at the hospital with, and then would come home at night. So it was like my work was recovering. So that was the start of my mental health recovery, but I didn't have the vocabulary to understand that it was recovery, even though that's what they were doing, because it was like structured groups all day long, where you do psychotherapy, art therapy, occupational therapy, all that kind of stuff all day long with other people, with serious mental illness. So, and so I did that for a few months until I was stable and got bored, because the curriculum starts getting boring because you're doing the same thing you've done last month and the month before. And so then I decided, so after that I went on disability, and that's when my son was 4 or 5 years old. And I've been on disability ever since. So that was the start of it. I think, but really the real huge part of my mental health recovery, because I was just going into psychotherapy, individual psychotherapy during this time after the hospitalization, individual psychotherapy and seeing a psychiatrist. And it wasn't until I became involved in NAMI's peer-to-peer program that I really fully understood what mental health recovery was. Yes, I was in mental health recovery, and that's really what the program at the hospital was. It was a great program, but I didn't understand that that's what I was in, and that's what I was undergoing, and that there was such a thing as mental health recovery. So, and that concept that you can recover from with a serious mental illness, and that recovery is possible. It doesn't mean that you're never symptomatic, or that your mental illness goes away, but it means that you can live a meaningful, fulfilling, purposeful life, and that you can take good care of yourself, and that if you do have symptoms, you know how to respond and get help, and that it's recovery is not linear, but it definitely, that was really when I fully started to understand what mental health recovery meant, and that I had been that I was in mental health recovery.
Wow, that's great. I mean, that's a great turning point. And then
yeah. Well, and also what's interesting is that right after the hospitalization, so it's sort of like that kind of tied back to right after the hospitalization, I did go to seminary. So the fall after being hospitalized, I went to seminary. And it was clear in the papers I was writing and in the work I was doing that my call was to a mental health ministry. And so it didn't mean that I was doing that ministry at that very moment. But that is what I'm doing, is basically a mental health ministry. I'm, helping people by sharing my story. I geek out on all the science around, mental health issues, mental health conditions and brain, what's going on with the brain and all that kind of stuff. So I do a lot of sharing of great articles from the NIMH, which is the National Institute of Mental Health, and the the Brain and Behavioral Research Foundation. So I geek out a lot and share a lot of great content on social media. So I'm going back to that early self who wanted to become a brain surgeon and a neurosurgeon and stuff. So I'm still, I still geek out about the brain. And so that's part of my mental health ministry. Part of it's having, just being out there speaking and sharing and listening to others like us, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, I noticed, I'm on your social sites, and I see you posting all the time about, different articles and blog posts and information, the science of it. And honestly, it's great that you put that out there like that, because, more people than are reading those, even the ones that aren't commenting or liking it. It's great information, and somebody needs to put it out there, so like you're saying it, you're calling it a mental health ministry, and it really is, because you're putting out the information. Sometimes when people are on social sites, they're not necessarily searching it out, but if they see your posts, you're educating them, because it makes it easier for them to find that information, and it makes it easier for them to understand what's going on. And, in my opinion, I mean, I think that's a great, avenue to take, being a mental health advocate like yourself.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're
I mean, I've
welcome.
been, ever since I started to do the blog, to write online, I've sort of got into the whole social media thing. And I think that was 2013. I started to write online. The reason my book's called Balancing Act is because I write about not just my mental health journey with bipolar disorder, but parenting. I balanced that with parenting a high needs son. My son had ADHD, depression, anxiety, and migraines. Actually, migraines are very much tied in with the depression and anxiety, because they're just his migraines were debilitating. So I had to balance taking care of my mental health with taking care of my son. And also my parents, at the end of their lives, they both had dementia. So although they were in memory care, I was the primary contact for, all things, taking care of making decisions, like my son, my sister and I, but I was the local contact. So me with the support of my sister were, basically in the position of now being caretakers of our parents. Even though
Wow.
you're not the primary caretaker, it was a little bit too challenging with two of them having dementia and me having bipolar. We thought of moving in with them, and my sister said no. She's like, that's just not good for you. That would not be a good situation. And they were challenging, actually, even in memory care. It took some trial and error to get them care.
So it sounds like to me, going through your life with mental illness, you were getting an education on it from yourself, and then having your son who's a high needs, ADHD and the issues that he had to deal with, and then ending up being a caretaker. You really have a wisdom about like all aspects of mental, health and mental illness.
Yes, and that goes to the back to the acceptance you were talking about. So what I learned through all of this, and what was something that I would tell my younger self, is that you because I was a perfectionist and I thought that I had to be, like the best, I had to, become a doctor, a neurosurgeon, or I had to become a lawyer, or I had to, I had these super high expectations. And what I learned is that, I am, and I'm going to also just say, everybody can, think of this in terms of yourself. I am enough. I am loved. I am loving. I have a purpose. So that is the wisdom and what I would tell myself back then, and what everyone should tell themselves, really, is that you're enough. You're not alone. You have a purpose, even though you may not know what that purpose is in the moment, especially when you're going through those dark times, those crises, but that everyone has a purpose here. Everyone has a purpose, and everyone is worthy of love and is loved, even if we don't know it. We are. And that everyone is capable of loving. And so that to me is where acceptance is a spiritual thing, because those are all spiritual values, really, when you come to talking about love. When you come right down to it, that's why I love, like, Jesus's message so much, because
Right.
it's like,
Me
it's
too.
so simple.
Yep.
It comes down to just a basic message, and that is one of love, and forgiveness, and to forgive yourself for not being perfect. And that's what I used, like, in raising my son, and in telling myself what the one thing I like about Christianity is that, and I'm not just a Christian and not believing in other religions. I was raised to believe all religions are about love. That's how I was raised, and I agree. But the one thing I like about, let's say, the concept of Jesus is that Jesus was the one and only in that concept, in that myth, or in that story, God who was human. or human who was God. So he was perfect, but I'm not perfect.
Right. And we don't have to be.
And I don't have to be. Exactly.
No, we don't have to be.
I'm beautiful for who, we are beautiful and loving and as we are. So you take care of yourself. And actually there's another metaphor I love, which is in the Japanese, I might be saying the word wrong, but there's a pottery that they make where it's broken pottery that's put back together with gold. And as it's put back together, it's even more beautiful than the original pottery. And that's another metaphor to remember, is that when we put ourselves back together, we are even more beautiful. That in our brokenness, there's a spiritual,
like a transformation, almost like a transformation.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. I do. I like that, and that's a Japanese belief, like or pottery. You're saying from Japanese that they take something that's broken and transform it into something that's beautiful.
Correct. And
wow.
it's a very meaningful, like there's a very, like spiritual meaning to it.
Yeah, I like that.
What I mean? In doing it, it's a very deeply spiritual practice. And that practice, it's the same thing in terms of the concept of forgiveness and it's the same concept to me, is that we are, but in the Japanese concept, is that you're more than you were when you were whole. When you're broken and put back together, you're more beautiful. And one of the things that I've experienced is humility, that brings me has made me more compassionate, not just for myself, but for others. And I think that's the wisdom you gain, is to learn compassion for yourself, acceptance for yourself, and acceptance and compassion for others.
Well, I just want to thank you, Kitt, for being on today. I really appreciate you as an advocate. I appreciate you as a person. The wisdom that you can share and that you do share with people every day, every post that you put out there on social media, everything that you put on your website, taking the blogs, and you wrote your book. I just want to, thank you for being, who you are and what you stand for, and you're appreciated, and if people want to reach out to you, is kittomalley.com the best avenue to take?
Yes, I would say so. I've got all my links to all my social media on there. So that's a great place. And also a link to email on my website too, which is kitt@kittomalley.com. So kittomalley.com, kittomalley.com is the best way to contact me.
Okay, so I'll have everything in the show notes, and people can contact you through your website, through all your social media sites, your email, and all your information. I do recommend reading Balancing Act, Writing Through a Bipolar Life. It's a great book. And again, Kitt, I appreciate you being on today.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for having this podcast.
Not a problem. I appreciate it. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Instinctive Talk. If you want to connect with me, please visit my website at instinctivebird.com. If you want to buy a personalized version of my book, No More Crutch, it's also available on my website. Again, this is Jay and Sulaco. Thanks for listening. Tune in next time to Instinctive Talk.